There is a kind of darkness that has nothing to do with night. It does not arrive with the setting of the sun or the drawing of curtains against the evening cold. It does not follow the familiar rhythm of dusk and dawn that human beings have organized their lives around since the very first fires were lit against the prehistoric sky. This particular darkness arrives quietly, carried on winds that circle the entire planet, woven into the fabric of clouds that form not from moisture alone, but from something older, something coughed up from the deepest furnaces of the earth itself. It arrives slowly enough that people do not notice it coming, and by the time they understand what has happened, the seasons themselves have already begun to fail. This is the story of the year 1816, the year that had no summer, the year that a single volcanic eruption on a distant island in the Dutch East Indies rewrote the climate of the entire northern hemisphere, starved millions of people across 3 continents, triggered the largest mass migration in American history up to that point, inspired the creation of 2 of the most enduring works of Gothic literature ever written, and may have quietly erased from the record books an entire chapter of human civilization that the official histories have never fully explained. But we will get to all of that slowly. There is no reason to rush. The night is long, and the story is longer, and some of the most important things about 1816 are the things that happened quietly, in the margins, in the spaces between the events that historians chose to write down and the events that perhaps were never meant to be written down at all. Settle in. Let the weight of the day begin to leave your shoulders. The story begins not in 1816, but a year before it, on an island called Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, where a mountain had been sleeping for a very, very long time. The mountain was called Tambora, and in April of 1815, it woke up. To understand what happened on Tambora in 1815, you have to first understand the kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room or the restful silence of a sleeping house, but a geological silence, the kind that stretches across centuries, that lulls entire generations into a false sense of permanence. Tambora had last erupted in any significant way roughly 5,000 years before 1815. 5,000 years. That is a span of time longer than recorded human history in most parts of the world. Entire empires had risen and fallen in that interval. Languages had been born and gone extinct. The coastlines of continents had shifted, and through all of it, Tambora had simply sat there, a broad volcanic cone rising to approximately 14,000 feet above the warm waters of the Flores Sea. Its slopes forested and green, its summit occasionally fuming but offering nothing that would alarm the people who lived in its shadow. There were people on Sumbawa. There had been people there for a very long time. The Tamboran people, sometimes called the Tamboran Kingdom, had their own language, their own customs, their own understanding of the mountain that dominated their landscape. They grew rice and traded with neighboring islands. They had survived for generations in the shadow of a volcano they could not have known was waking up beneath their feet. When Tambora finally erupted, the Tamboran people and their language were essentially erased from the earth. The explosion that ended their world was so complete, so total, that within a few years there was almost no one left who had spoken their language or remembered their particular way of being alive in the world. The eruption began in earnest on the 5th of April, 1815. Locals on nearby islands heard sounds they initially mistook for cannon fire, assuming some distant naval battle was underway in the waters of the archipelago. The British governor of Java, Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, dispatched troops to investigate what he believed was a military engagement. There was no military engagement. What they had heard was the mountain beginning to tear itself open. By the 10th of April, Tambora had reached the peak of its fury. The eruption produced what geologists classify as a volcanic explosivity index rating of 7, meaning it expelled somewhere between 100 and 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in terms that might mean something outside of a textbook, The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which collapsed an entire mountainside and killed 57 people and made headlines around the world, had a volcanic explosivity index of 5. The difference between a 5 and a 7 on this scale is not merely additive. Each number on the scale represents a tenfold increase in explosive force. Tambora was 100 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. It remains the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The mountain, which had stood at roughly 14,000 feet before the eruption, was reduced to approximately 9,000 feet afterward. It had lost, by conservative estimate, 5,000 feet of its own height in a single catastrophic event. The caldera left behind was 4 miles wide and over 3 miles deep. The island of Sumbawa was covered in ash and pyroclastic material to a depth that suffocated every living thing. The surrounding seas ran dark with floating debris for weeks afterward. The tsunami generated by the eruption killed an estimated 10,000 people on the immediate coastal areas of the surrounding islands within hours of the eruption's peak. The death toll in the immediate vicinity of Tambora was approximately 10,000 from the eruption itself and the tsunamis it triggered. But these deaths, as terrible as they were, are not the reason 1816 is remembered. The reason 1816 is remembered is what the mountain sent into the sky. When a volcano of Tambora's magnitude erupts, it does not merely release lava and ash onto the land below it. It fires enormous quantities of material into the stratosphere, the layer of atmosphere that begins roughly 7 miles above the Earth's surface and extends upward to approximately 30 miles. In the stratosphere, things behave differently than they do at ground level. The winds that move through the stratosphere are global in their reach, circling the entire planet in patterns that do not respect the political boundaries or seasonal rhythms of the world below. Material that reaches the stratosphere does not simply fall back down to Earth within days or weeks, the way ordinary volcanic ash does. It can remain suspended for years. Tambora released an estimated 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. As sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor in the stratosphere, it forms sulfuric acid aerosols, microscopic droplets that scatter and absorb incoming solar radiation. These aerosols create what climate scientists call a volcanic winter, a measurable reduction in the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. In the case of Tambora, the reduction in global average temperatures has been estimated at between 0.4 and 1.7 degrees Celsius over the following year. That may sound like a small number. It is not a small number. The difference between a cold summer and a growing season that fails entirely can be measured in fractions of a degree. The difference between a year where grain ripens and a year where grain rots in the field is, in many climates, a difference of less than 1 degree Celsius. But there was something else happening in 1815 and 1816 that made the Tambora eruption even more devastating in its effects than it might otherwise have been. The year 1816 did not arrive at the end of an otherwise normal climatic period. It arrived at the end of what historians and climatologists have identified as the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of relative global cooling that had begun sometime around the 14th century and had been gradually easing its grip on the Northern Hemisphere throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Average temperatures across Europe and North America in 1816 were already running lower than what we would consider normal by modern standards. The Tambora aerosols did not simply cool a warm world, they cooled an already cool one. And there is still another layer to this story, one that conventional histories mention only briefly, one that the alternative history community has spent considerable energy examining. In the years immediately before 1816, there had been other volcanic eruptions around the world, smaller than Tambora, but collectively significant. Eruptions that had already begun loading the stratosphere with aerosols before Tambora added its catastrophic contribution. The volcano Soufriere on the island of St. Vincent erupted in 1812. Mayon in the Philippines erupted the same year. Awu in the Dutch East Indies erupted in 1812 as well. Suwanosejima in Japan had been active. When Tambora finally discharged its vast quantity of material into an atmosphere that was already somewhat stratospherically loaded, the combined effect may have been significantly greater than Tambora alone would have produced. The world in 1815, as all of this was beginning to unfold, was not the world we know today. It is important to hold this in mind as the story moves forward, because many of the things that happened in 1816 happened to a world that was profoundly different from our own in ways that go beyond the merely technological. The Industrial Revolution was only beginning. The vast majority of human beings on Earth were still farmers or were directly dependent on farmers. There were no global supply chains delivering food from surplus regions to deficit regions with anything approaching the speed or efficiency that we take for granted. There were no refrigerated transport systems. There were no synthetic fertilizers to compensate for failing harvests. When the crops failed, people had almost nothing to fall back on. The distance between a bad harvest and starvation was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The world's population in 1815 was somewhere around 1 billion people. The exact number is uncertain, because census-taking in the modern sense barely existed in most of the world. But estimates place the global population at roughly 1 billion, a number that had taken the entirety of human history up to that point to reach, and that would roughly double within the next century. Nearly all of those 1 billion people were dependent, in one way or another, on the success of the agricultural growing season in their region. Nearly all of them were about to face a growing season that would fail. We do not fully appreciate living in the era of global food distribution and industrial agriculture and refrigerated shipping containers, what it meant to be alive in a world where if your local harvest failed, you died. Not eventually. Not after a long period of hardship. You died within months, sometimes weeks, of the harvest failing, unless you could walk or sail somewhere that the harvest had not failed. And in 1816, there were very few places on Earth where that was true. The cloud from Tambora moved across the sky of the entire northern hemisphere. It did not choose its victims. It simply reduced the sunlight available to growing things everywhere it went. And it went everywhere. The first sign that something was wrong with the year 1816 came in the spring, or rather, in the season that should have been spring, but was not quite behaving like one. In New England, April 1816 brought snowfall that was not unusual for April in that region. May brought cold snaps that were somewhat unusual, but not unprecedented. June, however, brought something that people had never seen and would never forget. On the 5th of June, 1816, snow fell across much of New England and into the mid-Atlantic states. Not frost. Not a cold night that touched the low-lying areas. Snow. Measurable, accumulating snow. On the 5th day of June. In Albany, New York, temperatures dropped to below freezing and stayed there for days. In Quebec, 18 inches of snow fell in early June. In Maine, farmers who had planted their early crops watched them freeze in the ground. In Vermont, it was cold enough in June to kill sheep that had already been shorn for the season. Animals that were not protected against temperatures that no one had thought to protect them against, because June was supposed to be warm. The people who experienced this did not have the atmospheric sciences to explain what was happening to them. They did not know about Tambora. News traveled slowly in 1816, and the news that did travel rarely carried the kind of scientific explanation that would have made sense of the strange cold. What they knew was what they could see and feel and taste. They knew that their crops were dying. They knew that the sky had a quality to it that was different from what they remembered. A dustiness, a yellowish cast in the afternoon light, a strangeness in the color of the sunset that people remarked upon with a mixture of wonder and dread. Some of them wrote about these sunsets in letters and diaries that have survived to the present day, describing colors of extraordinary vividness, reds and purples and yellows that seemed almost artificial, as if the sky were on fire in a way that had nothing to do with the ordinary daily death of sunlight. These sunsets were real, and they were caused by the Tambora aerosols, the same particles that were scattering enough incoming solar radiation to cool the Earth by a degree or more. were also refracting the light that did reach the surface in ways that produced spectacular atmospheric optical effects. The painters of Europe noticed. J. M. W. Turner, the British landscape painter, whose work would define the romantic approach to light and atmosphere in the early 19th century, painted skies in the years following 1815 that art historians have long recognized as capturing something genuinely unusual about the atmosphere of that period. The fiery, turbulent, almost apocalyptic quality of Turner's skies from this period is not merely artistic license, it is documentary evidence. The sky really did look like that. In the American South, temperatures in the summer of 1816 fluctuated wildly between brief periods of normal warmth and devastating cold, snaps that swept down from the north and killed crops that had just barely recovered from the previous cold snap. Farmers who planted lost their crops, planted again, lost them again, planted a third time, and watched those crops die as well. Describe in contemporary accounts a kind of exhausted disbelief, a mounting certainty that something fundamental had changed about the world they lived in, though they could not say what. July 1816 brought frosts to New England. August brought more. In some areas of Vermont and New Hampshire, there was essentially no frost-free growing period at all in 1816. The summer simply did not happen. Corn was the staple crop of much of the American Northeast, and corn requires warmth to grow and ripen. The corn crop of 1816 was essentially a total failure across large portions of the region. Hay, which farmers depended on to feed their livestock through the winter, was scarce. Oats and wheat fared somewhat better in some areas, but still far below normal yields. The animals that farmers had depended on for work and food began to die from lack of forage. The sheep died, the cattle grew thin. The pigs that had been fattened on surplus grain had no surplus grain to fatten on. The price of food rose with devastating speed. Corn, which had sold for around 50 cents a bushel in 1815, rose to over $2 a bushel by the autumn of 1816 in many parts of New England. For a farm family that had failed to raise any of its own corn and now needed to buy corn to survive the winter, a fourfold increase in the price of a staple food was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence, depending on how much savings they had and how severe the coming winter was expected to be. The winter of 1816 into 1817 was, as it happened, brutal. Some of the coldest temperatures ever recorded in parts of northeastern North America fell in that winter. Lake Champlain froze early and stayed frozen late. Rivers that were normally navigable by this point in the season were locked under ice. The people who had not been able to grow enough food to see them through a normal winter were now facing a worse than normal winter, with depleted food stores and no money to buy what they needed at the elevated prices the market was demanding. This is when the migrations began, and this is where the story of 1816 begins to acquire a quality that goes beyond the merely meteorological, a quality that touches something deeper in the human story, something that the conventional history of this period only partially illuminates. The migration out of New England that began in 1816 and accelerated through 1817 and 1818 was one of the largest movements of population in American history up to that point. Entire communities picked up and left. Families that had farmed the same land for 3 or 4 generations, families whose names were on the oldest gravestones in the oldest churchyards in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, simply loaded what they could carry onto wagons and walked west. They walked toward New York's western frontier, toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward the territories beyond. They were following reports, some accurate and some wildly exaggerated, of richer soils and milder climates in the interior of the continent. The phrase that is said to have spread through New England during this period, the phrase that served as the rallying cry for these mass departures, was simply this: "Gone to Ohio." Families would sometimes leave in the night without telling their neighbors. Whole villages would lose a third of their population in a single season. Farmsteads that had taken generations to clear and build were abandoned to the forest, which reclaimed them with the patient efficiency that forests always bring to abandoned human places. Contemporary accounts describe a kind of desperate energy in these departures, a combination of grief and determination. People leaving behind everything they had known for the chance of something better somewhere else. They left behind their churches and their churchyards, their stone walls built by hand over generations, their apple orchards just beginning to bear fruit, their root cellars dug deep into the hillsides, their mills along the frozen streams. They left behind the graves of their parents and grandparents. They walked west toward a future that was uncertain, but that at least promised food, the most basic thing a human being requires. The Ohio River Valley and the territories beyond it received this flood of New England migrants and were transformed by it. The settlement of the American Midwest accelerated dramatically in the years following 1816, driven in significant part by the failure of the growing season in the Northeast. The demographic map of the United States was redrawn, quietly and without fanfare, by a volcanic eruption in a distant archipelago that most of the people making these desperate journeys knew nothing about. But New England was only one part of the story. The Tambora aerosol cloud did not stop at the American coastline. It circled the entire northern hemisphere, and it arrived over Europe carrying everything it had already done to the Western Atlantic, and doing it again to a continent that was, in many ways, even less prepared to cope with the consequences. Europe in 1816 was a continent that had just finished fighting the most devastating series of wars in its history up to that point. The Napoleonic Wars, which had consumed the energies and treasure and lives of virtually every major European power for over 2 decades, had ended with Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in June of 1815, just 2 months after Tambora's eruption. The armies that had been living off the land, consuming the agricultural surplus of every region they passed through, had been disbanded. The economies of France and Germany and the Low Countries and the Italian states were in ruins. The peasantry across much of continental Europe had been impoverished by decades of war taxation, by the seizure of their livestock for military purposes, by the destruction of their villages and the disruption of their agricultural practices. They had no reserves, they had no savings, they had eaten their seed corn. And now the sky was turning strange colors, and the summer was not coming. The spring of 1816 in France came late and cold. The vineyards that were the economic backbone of many French rural communities showed early signs of distress, their growth retarded by temperatures that were simply not warm enough for the vines to develop properly. The grain crops planted across northern France and into the German states emerged from the cold soil slowly and never quite recovered the vigor they needed to produce a full harvest. By midsummer, it was clear that the harvest across most of Western and Central Europe would be severely reduced. By autumn, when the actual yield of the harvest could be measured against the need of the populations depending on it, the scale of the shortfall was catastrophic. In France, grain prices more than doubled between the summer of 1816 and the spring of 1817. In Germany, they tripled in some areas. In Switzerland, the shortage was severe enough that the government began organizing emergency food distributions in an attempt to prevent the starvation that was already visible in the streets of cities and towns. Ireland, which had always occupied a precarious position in the European food economy due to its dependence on a single crop, suffered terribly. The potato crop, which fed the majority of the Irish peasantry, failed partially in 1816. This was not the total failure that would come in the 1840s, but it was severe enough to cause real hardship and, in some areas, genuine famine conditions. Typhus, which tends to follow famine with predictable and terrible efficiency, swept through the population that had been weakened by hunger. It has been estimated that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people died in Ireland during the 1816 to 1819 period from the combined effects of crop failure and the epidemic disease that followed it. In Wales and Scotland, the harvest failures drove upland farmers off land that had marginal agricultural potential even in normal years. The Highland clearances, the process by which Scottish landlords evicted their tenant farmers in order to convert the land to sheep grazing, were in full progress during this period, and the climate catastrophe of 1816 accelerated a process that was already underway. Families who might have survived on the margins of a functioning agricultural economy in good years had no margin at all in 1816, and the landlords who might have been persuaded to extend some leniency in better times had no reason to do so when the land itself was not producing enough to make tenancy worthwhile. In Germany, the harvest failures of 1816 and 1817 created conditions of genuine mass starvation in some regions. Contemporary accounts from Württemberg, from Bavaria, from the Rhine Valley, describe scenes of desperate poverty, people eating grass and field clover and the bark of trees, begging on roads that were already crowded with others doing the same. The roads of Germany in 1816 and 1817 were rivers of displaced people, moving toward cities that had no more food than the countryside, toward ports where ships might take them somewhere else, toward any point on the compass that offered even the rumor of relief. Some of them went to Switzerland and found the Swiss struggling too. Some of them went to the Netherlands and found the Dutch managing somewhat better, but overwhelmed by the numbers arriving. Some of them went to ports and got on ships. Many of those ships were headed to North America, to the same general destination as the New England farmers walking west, to the promise of land and food in a continent that was younger and less crowded than the one they were leaving. The great wave of German immigration to North America that would reshape American demographics over the course of the 19th century did not begin in 1816, but 1816 was one of the events that drove it forward with new urgency. The German communities that would eventually establish themselves across Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Missouri were founded in significant part by people who had left their homes because the year 1816 had made those homes uninhabitable. They carried with them memories of cold summers and starving children and roads crowded with the desperate and the dying, memories that were passed down through generations and that shaped the character of the communities they built in their new country in ways that are difficult to fully trace, but that are nonetheless real. But we need to turn our attention further east, because the Tambora aerosol cloud did not stop at the western shores of Europe any more than it stopped at the eastern shores of North America. It moved east across the continent, across the vast plains of Russia, across the Caucasus and the Fertile Crescent, across Central Asia, and eventually into China and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. The summer was going to be strange this year. The rains were going to come at the wrong times or not at all. The crops were going to struggle. In China, the growing season of 1816 was disrupted in ways that are documented in Chinese official records from the period, though the interpretation of those records has been subject to debate. Rice cultivation in Yunnan province, which normally produced reliable harvests in the subtropical climate of that region, was devastated by unusually cold temperatures in the summer of 1816. The Yangtze River Delta, which was one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world and which fed a substantial portion of China's enormous population, experienced temperature anomalies that reduced the yield of the summer rice crop significantly. In India, the monsoon system, which is the engine of South Asian agriculture and the source of life for hundreds of millions of people, was disrupted. The monsoon rains that agricultural communities in the subcontinent had organized their entire existence around for millennia came late and in reduced quantity to some regions and in excess to others. The disruption of the monsoon is one of the most dangerous things that can happen in South Asia, because the entire food economy of the region is calibrated to the monsoon's normal behavior, and any significant deviation from that behavior can have cascading consequences that ripple through the agricultural system for years. The Bengal region of eastern India experienced conditions in 1816 and 1817 that contributed to a cholera epidemic that would eventually become the first pandemic of cholera in recorded history, spreading from India westward across the Middle East into Europe and eventually reaching North America. Cholera is a disease of contaminated water, and it flourishes in conditions of social disruption, mass migration, and the breakdown of the rudimentary sanitation systems that communities maintain in normal times. The climate catastrophe of 1816 created exactly those conditions across a huge swathe of the inhabited world, and the cholera epidemic that emerged from India in the following years was one of the direct consequences. The first cholera pandemic, which began around 1817 and spread around the world over the following decade, killed millions of people. Its origins in the climate disruption caused by Tambora's eruption are not always emphasized in the conventional history of the disease, which tends to focus on the bacteriology and the transmission mechanisms rather than the social and environmental context that made the pandemic possible. But the connection is there in the records of disrupted harvests and displaced populations and overwhelmed water systems that preceded the epidemic's emergence. The volcano that erupted in April of 1815 was still killing people in 1826 and beyond, through the cascade of consequences that followed from the single event of its eruption. There is a dimension to the story of 1816 that mainstream historical accounts tend to treat as peripheral, as a curious footnote to the main narrative of crop failures and mass migration and political upheaval. It is the dimension that has captured the attention of those who study the alternative record of human history, those who look at the official narrative and find in it not lies exactly but silences, gaps, spaces where the record should be full and is instead strangely empty. The dimension we are speaking of is the question of who was already gone before 1816 arrived. The conventional history of the early 19th century presents the world of 1815 as a world in the process of recovery and consolidation after the Napoleonic Wars, a world of established nations and functioning societies and identifiable populations, a world that the year without a summer struck like a natural disaster strikes a functioning civilization, disrupting it and impoverishing it, but leaving its fundamental structure intact. The population numbers and the settlement patterns and the institutional frameworks that existed before 1816 were, according to this account, largely the same population numbers and settlement patterns and institutional frameworks that existed after it, merely stressed and reduced and displaced in various ways. But there are researchers and historians working outside the conventional academic framework who have looked very carefully at the population records of the early 19th century and found something that the conventional account does not adequately explain. The populations that were supposed to be there in the aftermath of 1816, the populations that the records say were present before the climate catastrophe, do not always fully correspond to the populations that the records show after it. The discrepancies are sometimes small and explicable by normal historical processes. But, in some cases, they are large enough and consistent enough to suggest that the story of 1816 is not merely the story of a climate disaster that struck an otherwise intact world. It may be the story of a climate disaster that struck a world that was already in the process of a far more profound transformation, a transformation that the official record has never fully acknowledged. This is the territory where the conventional history of 1816 ends and something else begins, something that requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to look at the spaces between the documented facts and ask what might have been happening in those spaces that nobody was recording, or that somebody was recording, but those records have been lost, or that somebody was recording, and those records still exist, but are not part of the history that is taught in schools and universities and repeated in the reference books that the conventional narrative draws upon. The night is quiet around you. The story is unfolding slowly, layer by layer, the way all the most important stories unfold, not in a sudden revelation, but in a gradual accumulation of detail that eventually becomes something you can see, whole. We are going to look at what the alternative historians call the reset. We are going to look at the evidence that 1816 was not merely a year of climate catastrophe, but a year that was preceded by and followed by a process of civilizational transformation that remains, even now, incompletely understood. We are going to look at the buildings and the roads and the orphans and the population gaps and the strange architectural features that appear in cities around the world and that the conventional history cannot fully account for. But first, we are going to stay a little longer with the sky of 1816, because it is in that sky that the story lives most vividly, and because the people who watched that sky and wrote about what they saw left behind a record that is more honest, in some ways, than the official histories that were compiled long after the fact by people who had reasons to present events in particular ways. The sky of 1816 was not simply overcast. It was not simply grey. The atmospheric aerosols from Tambora produced optical effects that people found deeply unsettling, that carried a quality of wrongness that was not merely aesthetic, but existential, a sense that the world had changed in some fundamental way, and that the change was not going to reverse itself on its own schedule. The haze that hung in the atmosphere throughout much of 1816 was visible to the naked eye during the day as a kind of drying and filtering of the light, a reduction in the vibrancy of colour that normally characterizes a clear summer sky. Blues were less blue, greens were muted. The sharp edges that good light gives to the visible world were softened in a way that was not restful but slightly disorienting, as if the world had been filmed through gauze. At sunset and sunrise, however, the aerosols produced effects of extraordinary, almost hallucinatory beauty. The scattered light created sunsets that people described in terms that reached for the supernatural, that invoked the end of the world, that used religious language because no other language seemed adequate to what the sky was doing. Brilliant reds and purples and deep yellows that spread across the entire horizon and lasted long after the sun had set. Afterglows that persisted into full darkness, a luminosity in the western sky that had no natural explanation, visible to people standing on the ground and looking at it. Benjamin Silliman, a Yale professor who was one of the most eminent American scientists of the early 19th century, wrote detailed descriptions of the unusual atmospheric phenomena he observed in 1816. He noted the peculiar haze that reduced the intensity of the sun's heat, even on clear days, the strange coloration of sunsets, the generally subdued quality of the summer light. Other American observers wrote in similar terms. In Europe, scientists and artists and ordinary people all noticed and commented on the quality of the atmosphere and the strangeness of the sky. In Switzerland, in the summer of 1816, on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young literary figures were sheltering from the uncharacteristic cold and rain of what was supposed to be a summer holiday, but was turning into something else entirely. Among this group were the poet George Gordon Byron, then in self-imposed exile from England after a series of social and personal scandals, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the radical poet and philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who was 18 years old and who would soon become Mary Shelley. They had come to the shores of Lake Geneva for the warmth and the beauty of the Swiss summer. The warmth and the beauty had not appeared. Instead, they had the rain and the cold and the strange skies of 1816. And they had each other, and they had their books and their imagination. Byron, in response to the extraordinary sunsets and the general atmospheric strangeness of that summer, wrote a poem that is sometimes considered one of the great works of apocalyptic literature in the English language. The poem is called, simply, Darkness. It begins with the line, "I had a dream," which was not all a dream. In it, Byron describes a world from which the sun has vanished, a world of cold and famine and extinction, a world where the last human beings on Earth huddle around dying fires and eat the bodies of those who have died before them. It is a vision of absolute civilizational collapse, written by a man who was sitting in the cold rain of a summer that was not behaving like summer, looking at skies that were doing things no summer sky had any business doing. The poem was written in a single creative burst in July 1816. It was published later that year. Its imagery of total darkness and total cold and the extinction of everything human is not, strictly speaking, a fantasy. It is, in some sense, a realistic extrapolation from the conditions of that summer, from the knowledge that the sun was being blocked by something in the atmosphere, that the cold was going to persist, that the crops were failing, that the world that Byron could see from his window at the Villa Diodati was not performing in the ways that a world in good order was supposed to perform. Mary Godwin, sheltering from the same rain and cold, began a different kind of story. She was 18 years old. She had already lived a life marked by extraordinary loss and extraordinary literary immersion. Her mother was the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who had died giving birth to her. Her father was the philosopher William Godwin, and she had grown up surrounded by books and ideas in a way that had given her an intellectual formation far beyond her years. That summer, on the shores of Lake Geneva, the group of writers and intellectuals staying at the Villa Diodati entertained themselves by reading German ghost stories aloud to each other, and eventually agreed to a contest in which each of them would write an original supernatural story. Byron's contribution became the fragment later reworked by his physician, John Polidori, into The Vampire, one of the foundational texts of vampire fiction. Percy Shelley's contribution was abandoned. Mary Godwin's contribution was a story she initially intended to be a short tale, but that grew under the pressure of her imagination and the strange circumstances of that cold summer into something much larger and more enduring. She called it Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. It was published 2 years later, in 1818, and it is still in print today, and it is still read in schools and universities around the world, and it is still considered one of the most important works of fiction ever written. It would be reductive to say that Frankenstein was caused by the year without a summer, that the cold and the failed harvests and the strange skies of 1816 produced Mary Shelley's novel in some simple mechanical way. Great works of art are never that simple. But it would be equally wrong to say that the atmosphere of that summer, in both the literal and the figurative sense, played no role in the creation of a novel that is obsessed with the usurpation of natural order, with the consequences of human beings reaching beyond their proper boundaries, with the catastrophic results of ambition unchecked by wisdom. Frankenstein is a novel written by someone who had just watched, with their own eyes, what happens when the natural world stops obeying the rules that people have organized their lives around. The monster that Victor Frankenstein creates and cannot control is, among other things, a metaphor for Tambora, for the natural force that was already loose in the atmosphere of 1816, doing its damage beyond the reach of any human intervention. The same summer that produced Frankenstein also produced, in a more direct and less literary way, a significant advance in human transportation technology. The connection is not usually made explicit in the histories of the period, but it is there and it is worth understanding. The failure of the oat and hay crops in 1816 across much of the Northern Hemisphere caused the prices of horse fodder to rise dramatically, which in turn made the keeping and use of horses significantly more expensive for both agricultural and transportation purposes. This placed particular pressure on the transportation systems of the early 19th century, which relied almost entirely on horse-drawn vehicles and were therefore entirely dependent on the availability of affordable horse fodder. The German inventor, Karl Dreis, confronted with this situation, began working on a vehicle that could serve some of the transportation functions of a horse without requiring any horse fodder at all. In 1817, he patented a device he called the loaf machine, or running machine, which consisted of 2 wheels connected by a frame that the rider sat astride and propelled by pushing their feet against the ground. It was the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle. The bicycle, and by extension, the entire modern cycling culture and the 2-wheeled transportation revolution that followed from it, was, in a very real sense, a consequence of the year without a summer, of Tambora's aerosols killing the oat crop and making horse fodder too expensive for ordinary people to afford. These connections, these threads running from a volcanic eruption in the Dutch East Indies, to a poem about darkness, to a novel about a monster, to the invention of the bicycle, are part of what makes 1816 such a strange and resonant year to contemplate. It is a year in which the visible and the invisible are wound together more tightly than usual, in which the causes of things are more distant and more unexpected than they normally appear to be, in which the assumption that the world is comprehensible and that the causes of events are proportionate to their effects is most thoroughly undermined. And it is in this quality of 1816, this quality of deep causation and hidden connection, that the alternative history of the period finds its most fertile ground. The Tartaria theory, for those who are encountering it for the first time, is a framework for understanding history that has been circulating in various forms in the alternative history community for several decades, but has gained significant visibility and a large popular following in the internet era. In its most basic form, it proposes that the official historical account of the pre-19th century world is substantially incomplete, that there existed across the vast territory of Eurasia, and possibly extending into the Americas, a civilization or network of civilizations that has been written out of the official record, that the cities and buildings and infrastructure that this civilization created were either destroyed or obscured in a process that the alternative historians call the reset, and that the official history that we have been taught has been constructed to fill the gap left by this erasure, with a narrative that is not exactly false, but that is systematically misleading about the nature and the timeline of human civilization. The specific mechanism of the reset varies depending on which version of the theory you encounter. Some proponents of the Tartaria hypothesis focus on the mud flood, a proposed event or series of events in which large quantities of mud and debris covered the lower levels of existing buildings and cities across wide areas of the world, burying what had been street-level entrances and windows below ground and creating the phenomenon that can be observed in many old cities today, where the ground floor entrances of old buildings are partially or entirely buried, requiring visitors to descend steps to reach what was once the ground floor level. Others focus on the atmospheric or geological disruption itself, suggesting that the climate catastrophe of 1816 was not merely the consequence of Tambora's eruption, but was associated with a more fundamental planetary event, a shift in the Earth's magnetic field or a celestial encounter or some other large-scale phenomenon that resulted in the destruction of an existing civilization and its replacement with the world as we know it. The Tambora eruption, in this reading, is not the cause of the reset, but one of the symptoms of it, one piece of evidence in a much larger pattern of catastrophic change that reshaped the inhabited world in the early 19th century. We are not here to adjudicate between these different versions of the theory, or to tell you which parts of it to believe and which parts to set aside. We are here to tell the story as richly and as honestly as we can, and that means acknowledging that the alternative history of 1816 raises questions that the conventional history does not always answer satisfactorily. One of those questions is the question of the orphans. The years following 1816 saw a remarkable and still only partially explained surge in the population of orphans and foundling children across multiple continents. The orphan trains that would become a defining feature of American social history later in the 19th century are usually discussed in the context of the post-Civil War period and the urban poverty of the Gilded Age. But the foundling hospital records and the poorhouse records and the church charity records of the 1816 to 1825 period tell a story that precedes that later, better-known history. Across New England, across the mid-Atlantic states, in cities from Boston to Philadelphia to New York, the number of children arriving in charitable institutions without parents or guardians rose sharply in the years immediately following the year without a summer. Some of this can be explained by the conventional account. When adults die of starvation or the diseases that follow starvation, they leave behind children who need to be cared for. When parents make the desperate decision to walk west toward Ohio or south toward warmer climates, they sometimes do not survive the journey, and the children who were with them end up in institutions. When the social fabric of a community is stressed by hunger and displacement and economic collapse. The family unit, which is the primary social institution in any pre-industrial society, can come apart in ways that produce orphans and abandoned children. But the numbers are, in some places and some periods, larger than the conventional explanation seems to fully account for. The records of certain foundling hospitals in New England and in major European cities show increases in their populations during the 1816 to 1820 period that go beyond what simple mortality from the climate disaster would predict, given the population numbers that the official record attributes to those regions before the disaster. There are more orphans than there should be, given the number of adults who supposedly died. There are more children without family histories, without the surnames and the parish records, and the community connections that would normally allow them to be placed in context. This is one of the data points that alternative historians point to when they argue that the official population figures for the early 19th century are not accurate, that the populations of certain regions were significantly larger before the events of 1815 to 1819 than the official record acknowledges, and that the missing people, the people who do not appear in the post-reset records as survivors or refugees or casualties, but who nonetheless left behind children who needed to be cared for, represent a segment of humanity that has been written out of the historical account. The claim is not that these people never existed. The claim is that the record of their existence was not preserved, or was preserved and then lost, or was preserved and then deliberately obscured, and that the orphans are the visible residue of an invisible population. This is a claim that requires careful examination. It is the kind of claim that can be made irresponsibly, in a way that is more interested in maintaining the mystery than in actually investigating it. And it is the kind of claim that can also be made seriously, with attention to the actual documentary evidence. The most honest thing we can say about it is that the population records of the early 19th century are genuinely incomplete and genuinely inconsistent in ways that professional historians acknowledge, even as they tend to attribute those inconsistencies to the normal imperfections of pre-modern record keeping. Census data from the early 19th century is notoriously unreliable. The United States did not conduct its first systematic national census until 1790, and the census methods of that period, and for several decades afterward, were crude by modern standards, often missing significant segments of the population, particularly those who were mobile or marginal or who lived in frontier areas where census takers did not always go. European census data from the same period varies enormously in quality across different countries and regions, with some areas having quite good records and others having records that are essentially non-existent. When alternative historians point to population gaps and unexplained orphan surges and architectural anomalies and suggest that these are evidence of a hidden history, the professional historian's response is usually to attribute these phenomena to the inadequacy of the records rather than to any actual civilizational discontinuity. This response is not unreasonable. Record keeping before the modern era was genuinely inadequate, and many of the apparent anomalies in the historical record can be at least partially explained by that inadequacy. But partial explanation is not full explanation. And there are aspects of the built environment of the early 19th century that the explanation of inadequate record keeping does not touch at all, because they are not questions of records, but questions of stone and brick and the physical presence of buildings in the world. These are the questions that concern the mudflood hypothesis, and they are questions that deserve to be taken seriously, even by people who are skeptical of the grander claims of the Tartaria theory. The mudflood hypothesis, stripped of its most speculative elements, rests on an observable phenomenon that anyone can verify for themselves in a number of cities around the world. In many cities that contain buildings from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and in some cities that contain older buildings from what is officially classified as the medieval and early modern period, there is a pattern in the built environment that is difficult to explain by conventional architectural history. The ground floor windows and doors of these buildings are positioned in a way that suggests the ground level of the street when they were built was significantly lower than the current street level. In some cases, what is now a basement or a sub-basement window was originally a ground floor window. In some cases, what is now accessible only by descending a set of steps to a below street level entrance was originally an entrance at street level. This phenomenon is real. It is not an invention of the alternative history community. Architectural historians and urban archaeologists have documented it in cities across Europe and North America and Russia. The conventional explanation for this phenomenon is a combination of gradual factors, the accumulation of debris over time, the raising of street levels by successive generations of road improvement and urban redevelopment, the compaction of soil, the effects of urban flooding, and the resulting deposition of silt. These are all genuine processes that do occur in urban environments over long time periods and that do result in the gradual raising of street levels. The question that the alternative historians ask, and that the conventional explanation does not always answer satisfactorily, is whether the raising of street levels in certain cities and in certain time periods can be fully accounted for by these gradual processes, or whether some portion of the observed street level change represents a more sudden and catastrophic event, a mudflood or a similar large-scale deposition event that covered the lower stories of existing buildings with material in a relatively short period of time. The answer to this question is not simple, and it is not the same for every city and every building. In some cases, the evidence for gradual street-level rise over long periods is clear and convincing. In other cases, the pattern of the evidence is more ambiguous, and the alternative historians who argue for a catastrophic mudflood event are not simply making things up. They are looking at real physical features of the built environment and proposing an explanation that, while contested, is not inherently unreasonable. What connects the mudflood hypothesis to the year without a summer is not always made explicit in the presentations of the theory that circulate in the alternative history community, but the connection is straightforward once you think about it. Volcanic eruptions, particularly large ones, do not only affect the atmosphere, they affect the land. The pyroclastic material and the volcanic ash that Tambora ejected into the atmosphere in such quantities that it circled the entire globe also fell back to Earth, not only on the immediate vicinity of the volcano, but in smaller quantities over enormous areas. Volcanic ash, when it falls in sufficient quantities, does not simply add a thin layer of fine material to existing surfaces. It can bury them. It can fill in low-lying areas, raise floodplains, change the drainage patterns of river systems, and in the aftermath of the floods and the rains that often follow volcanic events, can be transported by water into urban areas and deposited there. The 1816 to 1819 period was a period of unusual precipitation in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, with patterns of rainfall and flooding that deviated from historical norms. Rivers flooded at unusual times and with unusual severity. The connections between the atmospheric disruption of the post-Tambora period and unusual flooding events is documented in the meteorological and hydrological records of the time. If there were already populations that had been displaced or destroyed by the climate catastrophe, if there were already communities that had been abandoned, if the social fabric that would normally organize the repair and maintenance of flood defenses had been disrupted, then the combination of unusual rainfall and weakened urban maintenance could have resulted in levels of sediment deposition in some urban environments that went beyond what the gradual processes of normal urban accumulation would produce. This is not proof of a mudflood. It is a plausible mechanism for a kind of localized mudflood, or rather a series of localized flood and sediment events that could account for some portion of the observed street-level changes in cities from the early 19th century period. Whether the scale of those events was sufficient to produce the full pattern of changes that the mudflood hypothesis attributes to them is a question that the physical evidence alone cannot fully answer, and that the historical records from the period are, as we have already noted, too incomplete to resolve with certainty. What we can say, without overstating the case, is that the world in the years immediately following 1816 was a world in which the physical environment and the human landscape were both being changed simultaneously by forces that were larger than ordinary human experience and that fell outside the categories of normal historical narrative. People were moving, buildings were being abandoned, communities were being dissolved. The ground was being altered by unusual precipitation, and the deposits of volcanic material carried on wind and water. The records that would normally document all of this were being kept by institutions that were themselves under stress, that had their own survival to worry about, that were not always in a position to maintain the kind of careful documentation that normal times would have produced. Into this disrupted landscape, the official history then arrives with its narrative of what happened, and the alternative historians, looking at the gaps between the narrative and the physical evidence, suggest that the narrative is telling only part of the story. We are going to let the story breathe here for a moment. The air around you is still and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps, the sound of wind or rain against a window, or the settling of the house into its nighttime silence. The year 1816 is far away in time, but it is not as far away as it sometimes seems, because the world it made, the world of mass migration and disrupted populations and cities, growing over their buried predecessors and populations that cannot quite be accounted for in the records, is still, in some sense, the world we live in. The migrations that 1816 set in motion continued for decades. The political upheavals that the famine and displacement of 1816 and 1817 triggered did not resolve themselves quickly. The hunger that stalked Europe in those years and the desperation that followed it were among the forces that would eventually produce the revolutionary movements of 1830 and 1848, the great social convulsions of the mid-19th century that remade the political map of Europe. The grain markets that were distorted by the failures of 1816 created patterns of international trade in agricultural commodities that shaped the economies of nations for generations. The populations that moved, that left New England for Ohio, and left Germany for Pennsylvania, and left Ireland for everywhere, created new communities in new places, and left behind empty places where communities had once been. And those patterns of presence and absence are still legible in the landscape of North America and Europe, if you know how to look for them. And the orphans who arrived at the doors of the foundling hospitals and the poorhouses and the church charities of the 1816 to 1820 period, the children without surnames or family histories or the parish records that would have situated them in the social world of their time, grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children, and the thread runs forward from that moment of disruption and loss to the present in ways that cannot be traced, but that are nonetheless real. There are people alive today who are the descendants of those foundling children, who carry in their genealogy a gap, a missing generation, or a missing name, that connects them to the year without a summer in ways they will never fully know. This is one of the things that the alternative history of 1816 is really about. When you strip away the more speculative elements and look at what is underneath them, it is about the recognition that history, the official history, the one taught in schools and written in the reference books, is not the full story of what happened. It is a selection from the full story. It is a narrative constructed by people who had to make choices about what to include and what to exclude, and those choices were not always made on the basis of pure scholarly disinterest. They were made in contexts of power and politics and institutional interest, and they were made with incomplete information, and they were made at a time when the tools for recovering the full record of past events were far less powerful than the tools we have today. The alternative history community, at its best, is engaged in the project of asking what was left out, not to replace the official history with a new myth, not to claim that everything we have been taught is false, but to look at the spaces where the official account goes thin, or silent, or inconsistent, and to ask what might have been happening there, that nobody was writing down or that got written down and then lost. The year 1816 is a particularly rich place to ask those questions, because it was a year of such profound disruption that even the official history acknowledges extraordinary things were happening. It was a year when populations moved on a scale that was unprecedented in living memory, when communities dissolved, when the normal infrastructure of record-keeping broke down under the pressure of disaster. If there were things happening in 1816 that the official record was not capturing, the year, without a summer, was the moment when those things would be least likely to be captured, because everyone who might have been doing the capturing was too busy surviving. The surviving records of 1816 are extraordinary in their own right. They include some of the most vivid and immediate descriptions of climate disaster in the historical literature, accounts written by people who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them, but who described their experience with a clarity and an honesty that is often more revealing than the more polished historical narratives that came after. They described the cold and the strange light, and the dying crops, and the roads crowded with displaced people, with a directness that is sometimes difficult to read, because it is the directness of people who are in the middle of a catastrophe and know it. One of the most striking features of these first-hand accounts is their geographic diversity. We have accounts from New England farmers, and from European peasants, and from Chinese provincial officials, and from Indian administrators, and from travelers in Russia, and from scientists in Switzerland, and from poets in Switzerland, and from the residents of cities all around the North Atlantic world. And across all of this geographic diversity, the accounts share a common quality. They are accounts of people confronting something that they did not expect and could not explain, something that fell outside the normal range of their experience and the conceptual frameworks they had available for making sense of the world. The farmer in Vermont who wrote in his diary in June of 1816 that the cold was such as he had never seen in all his years and that he feared what would become of his family before the winter was done, was not using any unusual or elevated language. He was writing in the plain language of a practical man who was trying to understand an unprecedented situation. The European intellectual who described the quality of the summer light in elaborate aesthetic terms was doing the same thing from a different cultural position, reaching for the language and the frameworks available to him. The Chinese provincial official who recorded in the administrative record the failure of the rice crop in Yunnan in terms of its consequences for tax collection and social order was also doing the same thing. All of them were people confronted with something outside their experience, trying to describe it in the terms available to them. What none of them had was the atmospheric science to understand why it was happening. What none of them knew was that the cause of everything they were experiencing was a mountain on an island 10,000 miles away that had destroyed itself in April of the previous year and had sent 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. What none of them could have known was that the same cloud of aerosols that was blocking the sun over their particular corner of the world was blocking it over every other corner of the northern hemisphere as well. That their private catastrophe was also the catastrophe of millions of other people who would never know their names. This is another thing that 1816 teaches us, if we are willing to receive the lesson. It teaches us about the invisibility of connection. The farmer in Vermont and the peasant in Bavaria and the rice grower in Yunnan were all part of the same event, all subject to the same cause, all experiencing the same consequence in their different contexts and with their different frameworks. But they could not know this. The connections that linked their experiences were invisible to them. The event that was shaping all of their lives was happening in a part of the world they had never seen and had probably never thought about, caused by a geological process that operated on timescales and spatial scales completely outside ordinary human experience. We live in an era when some of these invisible connections have become visible, when the science of atmospheric chemistry and climatology allows us to trace the link from Tambora to Vermont and Yunnan, when the global communications infrastructure allows us to know immediately what is happening in every corner of the world. But the fundamental condition of being shaped by forces that are too large and too distant and too complex to see clearly, that condition has not changed. We are still, all of us, living within processes that are larger than our individual awareness, moved by causes that we do not always understand, connected to consequences that we cannot always predict. The sky of 1816 was a particularly vivid reminder of this condition. The sky was different, and the people under it knew it was different, and they could not explain why. They had to live with the knowledge that something had changed without knowing what had changed or how to make it change back. They had to make their decisions about whether to plant again after the first crop froze, about whether to stay or to go, about how to survive the winter in the context of a fundamental uncertainty about the nature of the world they were living in. There is something in this that resonates with our own time, with the particular quality of uncertainty that characterizes the early 21st century. The sense that the systems we have depended on are behaving in unexpected ways, that the frameworks we have used to understand the world are not quite adequate to the world as it actually is, that there are forces at work that we are not fully seeing. The people of 1816 did not have the science to understand what was happening to them, but they had the lived experience of it, the visceral knowledge that the world was not behaving as it should, and they found ways to respond to that knowledge that were sometimes creative and sometimes desperate, and always human. The year without a summer ended, in the technical sense, when the Tambora aerosols finally dissipated and the normal quantity of solar radiation began reaching the Earth's surface again. By 1818 and 1819, global temperatures were returning toward their pre-eruption levels. The growing seasons were improving. The prices of basic food commodities were beginning to fall back toward something more affordable. The immediate crisis was passing, but the world that emerged from 1816 was not the same world that had entered it. The migrations that had begun in the crisis years continued, carried forward by the momentum of all those people who had already left, who had already established communities in new places and were sending back reports of the possibilities available there. The political tensions that the famine had exacerbated did not simply resolve when the famine ended. The cholera pandemic that had been seeded by the climate disruption of 1816 was only beginning to spread westward and would continue to claim lives across the Northern Hemisphere for years. The patterns of trade and economics and population distribution that had been disrupted by the events of 1816 and 1817 did not snap back to their previous configuration. They reconfigured around the new realities that the disruption had created. This is always how history works. The event passes, but the consequences continue. The volcano stops erupting, but the climate changes it set in motion persist for years. The famine ends, but the migrations it triggered reshape demographics for generations. The crisis resolves, but the political tensions it revealed do not disappear simply because the immediate cause has been removed. History is not a series of discrete events, separated by periods of stability. It is a continuous process of cause and consequence, of disruption and adaptation, of loss and recovery, in which the past is always present in the forms and the patterns that it has created. The year 1816 is present in the world today in ways that are rarely acknowledged. It is present in the demographic patterns of New England, where the depopulation of rural communities that began in 1816 is still visible in the landscape of abandoned farms and overgrown stone walls, and the relatively sparse, rural populations of states that were once more densely settled. It is present in the ethnic composition of the American Midwest, shaped in significant part by the German and Scandinavian and Irish immigrants who came to those regions, partly as a result of the disruptions of 1816 and its aftermath. It is present in the history of public health, in the cholera pandemic that 1816 helped create and that changed the way cities thought about water supply and sanitation. It is present in literature, in Frankenstein and in Byron's Darkness, works that are still read and still resonate because they were shaped by a genuine encounter with the possibility of civilizational collapse. And it is present, perhaps, in the buried stories, the ones that the alternative historians are looking for, the ones that the orphan records and the population gaps and the strange features of the built environment seem to suggest were once there and are no longer legible in the official record. Whether those buried stories represent a lost civilization, a Tartarian network of cities and people that was erased in the catastrophe of the early 19th century, or whether they represent only the normal losses of history, the normal incompleteness of the record, the normal disappearance of the marginal and the powerless from the narratives that survive, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But it is a question worth asking, and the asking of it is itself a form of respect for the people who lived through the year without a summer and whose full story we do not know. In 1816, in a farmhouse in Vermont that no longer exists, a family made a decision. The decision was probably simple and desperate: to stay or to go. If they stayed, they faced a winter with depleted food stores and no certainty that the next growing season would be better. If they went, they faced an unknown journey toward an unknown destination, carrying what they could and leaving behind everything else. We do not know what they decided. We do not know their name. They were not famous. They were not important in the ways that history counts importance. They were ordinary people doing what ordinary people have always done in the face of catastrophe, which is to try to survive it. But they were there, and the sky above their farmhouse in that June of 1816 was the wrong color, shot through with the high aerosol haze of a volcano they had never heard of, filtering the sunlight that the crops they had planted needed in order to grow, turning the sunsets into something so strange and beautiful and terrifying that they would remember it for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in that filtered light, in that strange and beautiful and terrible sky, is the whole story of 1816. The visible part and the invisible part, the official history and the buried history, the record that was kept and the record that was lost. The night deepens, the story continues. We have been speaking of the great movements of people and the failures of harvests and the political consequences of a climate that had lost its summer. But there is a quieter dimension to 1816 that we have not yet fully explored, a dimension that requires a different kind of attention, a slower and more patient kind of looking. It is the dimension of the individual life lived inside the catastrophe, the private experience of a year that was supposed to be ordinary and turned out to be anything but. Across New England and upstate New York and the frontier territories beyond, there are diaries from 1816 that have survived in historical archives, written by farmers and ministers and merchants and school teachers, ordinary people who kept records of their daily lives as a matter of habit or faith, or the practical need to track the rhythms of an agricultural existence. These diaries, read in sequence, create a portrait of a year that is extraordinary in its ordinariness, in the way the catastrophe reveals itself, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small disappointments and small disasters, each one manageable alone, each one adding to the weight of the others until the weight becomes impossible to carry. A farmer in the Connecticut River Valley records in May that the cold snap has killed the young corn he planted last week and that he will have to plant again. He records it in the same tone he uses to record that the pig got into the garden again or that his wife has a cold. It is an inconvenience. He plants again. In June, he records another frost, with slightly more urgency, the third planting of corn. He is now behind in all his other work because he has had to plant 3 times when he should have had to plant once. In July, he records that the corn looks thin and yellow and that he doubts it will ripen before the first autumn frost. His tone has changed. There is something in the writing now that was not there in May, a quality of dread, of slow-dawning comprehension, that this year is not going to be an inconvenience, but a crisis. By August, he is writing about the hay. The hay is the problem he has been trying not to think about. Hay is what the animals eat in the winter. Hay is made from the summer's grass, cut and dried and stored in the barn. If the hay harvest is poor, the animals starve. And the animals are everything. They are the labor that plows the fields, and the milk that feeds the children, and the manure that fertilizes the crops. The hay harvest in the summer of 1816 is poor everywhere in New England. Not nothing, but not enough. Not enough to get through the kind of winter that a cold summer often predicts. He writes about this with a quietness that is more frightening than any dramatic language could be, the quietness of a man trying to think through a problem that may not have a good solution. September brings a killing frost earlier than it should come, and the corn that was thin and yellow in July is now frozen and black and good for almost nothing. He writes this down in a sentence and stops. There is nothing else to say about it. He will salvage what he can. He will look at what he has and try to figure out if it will be enough, and if it is not enough, he will try to figure out what to do about that. He is a practical man in a practical tradition that does not see much value in dwelling on what cannot be changed. October brings the first serious discussions among his neighbors about whether to stay or to go. He records these conversations, briefly, without editorial comment. His neighbor to the north is going to Ohio. His brother-in-law is talking about it. The minister gave a sermon about the trials of faith and the importance of endurance, which means the congregation has been asking him whether God has abandoned them, which means the situation is serious enough that the framework of faith itself is being tested. November, December. The winter comes in hard. He records the weather with the methodical precision of someone who has been watching weather his whole life, temperatures and precipitation and the state of the roads and the condition of the animals. The animals are losing weight. The hay is going faster than he calculated. He writes in a single line in December that he has slaughtered the oldest cow, the one that was not giving milk anymore, in order to have the meat and to reduce the number of mouths requiring hay. The decision is not commented on beyond the facts, but he has had that cow for 9 years. He raised her from a calf. There is something in the brevity of the entry that says everything about what the year has cost him. He survives the winter. His diary continues into 1817, which is better, not good, but better, and into 1818, which is better still. By 1819, the writing has resumed something like its normal pace and tone, the practical chronicle of an agricultural life that has absorbed the catastrophe and continued. But there is a name that appears in the diary in the spring of 1817, a neighbour's name, someone who had been a regular presence in the preceding years, mentioned casually in entries about shared labour and borrowed tools and the normal commerce of a farming community. And then the name stops appearing. It is not explained. There is no entry recording a death or a departure. The name is simply there, and then it is not there, and the diary moves on without acknowledgement. This is how history actually disappears, not in a dramatic moment of destruction, but in a silence, a gap, a name that stops appearing. The people who kept no diary left no gap. The people who were never written about were never not written about. The ones who disappear from the record are only the ones who had been in it to begin with, and they are the lucky ones, in a way, because at least they left a trace of their absence. The ones who were never recorded, who lived and struggled and perhaps died in the year without a summer, without anyone noting it down, those people are not even a gap. They are a silence that has no shape. The alternative history of 1816 is, at its heart, a history of that silence. It is the history of the people and the communities, and perhaps the entire civilization, that the year 1816 and its aftermath made silent, that the reset, whether we understand that word literally or metaphorically, erased or obscured or buried beneath layers of subsequent history. It is the project of listening to the silence and trying to hear what it contains. It is a project that will never be completed, because the nature of silence is that it does not offer its secrets easily, but the project itself is worthwhile. The act of paying attention to the absence, of refusing to accept that the silence is simply emptiness, that the gaps in the record are simply gaps rather than buried stories waiting to be recovered, is itself a form of historical justice. It is a refusal to let the disappeared be doubly disappeared, first by the event that took them, and second by the narrative that forgot them. The sky above 1816 was full of the remnants of a destroyed mountain, the material of what had been a 14,000-foot peak, now reduced to an aerosol veil circling the planet and filtering the sunlight and cooling the earth and killing the crops and driving the people, and perhaps, in ways that we still do not fully understand, reshaping the very landscape that the people left behind when they went. The mountain destroyed itself in order to change the world, as mountains sometimes do, as volcanoes sometimes do, as all the deep processes of the earth do when they reach the point that they can no longer contain their own energy. What they leave behind is always a new world, a world that is shaped by their passing in ways that persists long after the eruption is over, long after the aerosols have dissipated, long after the sky has returned to its ordinary blue. The world we live in today is, in small ways and large ways, the world that Tambora made, the world that the year without a summer created, the world that emerged from the migrations and the deaths, and the orphans and the abandoned farms and the buried buildings and the silenced communities of 1816. The people who lived through it would not know this, could not know this. They were trying to survive the winter, trying to find food, trying to decide whether to stay or to go. They did not know they were making history. They did not know that the color of the sunset they were watching from their cold fields in June of 1816, that extraordinary red and purple and yellow that spread across the horizon long after the sun had gone down, was the color of a world in the process of being remade. But we know it. We are able, at this and the remove, to see the whole shape of the event, to trace the connections from the eruption to the aerosols, to the cooling, to the crop failures, to the famines, to the migrations, to the diseases, to the political upheavals, to the books written by people sheltering from the cold summer rain on the shores of Lake Geneva. We are able to see it whole, or something close to whole, closer than the people who lived through it were able to see it. And seeing it whole is itself a kind of knowledge, not a comfortable knowledge, not a knowledge that makes the past less terrible, but a knowledge that makes it comprehensible, that situates the catastrophe within the larger story of how the world changes and how human beings adapt to that change. There is comfort in comprehension, even when what is being comprehended is terrible. The farmer in Vermont who watched his corn freeze and his neighbor disappear and the sky turn the wrong color could not comprehend what was happening to him in the full sense that we mean by comprehension. He could observe and endure and decide and survive, but he could not understand, not in the way that understanding gives peace. We can offer him that understanding posthumously, which is a strange and perhaps futile gift, but it is the best that history can do for those who made it, without knowing they were making it. The year without a summer is over now. It ended a long time ago. The aerosols dispersed. The sky returned to its ordinary blue. The climate slowly warmed back toward normal. The people who survived it built new lives or continued old ones with new knowledge of what was possible and what was fragile. The ones who did not survive it entered the silence. But the story is not over, because the consequences of what happened in 1816 are still unfolding in the long, patient way that history always unfolds, and because there are still questions, still gaps, still buried things that have not yet been found, still names that stopped appearing in the record and have not yet been recovered. The night around you is deep and quiet. The world outside is doing what the world does in the dark, turning slowly, breathing slowly, holding its complicated history in the way that it always does, in the rocks and the soil and the buried foundations of buildings that were once at street level and are now below it, in the genes of the descendants of the orphans and the migrants and the survivors, in the landscapes that were reshaped by the crisis of 1816 and have continued to be reshaped by everything that came after. There is a patience required for this kind of history, a willingness to sit with what is not fully known, to look at the gaps and the silences and the inconsistencies without demanding that they resolve themselves into clean narratives. The year without a summer does not resolve into a clean narrative. It remains, after 200 years of historical study, a story with edges that are not quite defined, with a middle that is not quite accounted for, with consequences that are still being traced. This is not a failure of the history. This is what history is. The full truth of what happened in 1816 is larger than any account of it, larger than the conventional history and the alternative history together, larger than the records that were kept and the records that were lost and the records that were never made. It is the actual experience of actual people in an actual year, and that experience will never be fully recovered, because experience does not fully survive its own moment. What survives are the traces, and the traces are incomplete, and the incompleteness is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be acknowledged. We acknowledge it here. We acknowledge the farmer in Vermont whose name we do not know. We acknowledge the neighbor whose name stopped appearing in the diary. We acknowledge the children who arrived at the doors of the foundling hospitals without surnames. We acknowledge the communities that dissolved without leaving enough of a record to be recovered. We acknowledge the civilization that the alternative historians are looking for in the gaps of the official history, whether it existed as they imagine it or not, because the act of looking for it is itself a form of acknowledgement that the gaps are real, that the silence contains something, that the people who lived and died in 1816 deserve to have someone trying to hear their story, even if the story cannot be fully recovered. The year without a summer. The year that had no summer. The year the sky turned strange, and the crops died, and the people moved, and the world changed in ways that are still being felt and still being understood. The year that a volcano destroyed itself, and in doing so remade the world that existed in the shadow of its eruption. The sky outside is dark now. The stars, if you could see them, would be the same stars that the people of 1816 looked at, the same stars that the farmer in Vermont looked at through his frosted June night, and did not know why the cold had come or where it would end. The stars have no memory of what passed beneath them. They hold no record of 1816, or of the people who survived it or did not survive it, or were erased from the memory of the world by it. The stars simply burn, as they have always burned, as they will burn long after. The last human memory of 1816 has dissolved into the silence that claims everything eventually. But we are not yet in that silence. We are here, in the now, that is also the product of every then that came before it, listening to the story of a year that remade the world and left questions that have not yet been answered and perhaps never will be. We are here at the edge of sleep, in the long dark, in the quiet, with the weight of 200 years of history, lying gently on the night around us. Let it rest there. Let the questions rest. Let the silence of 1816 and all its buried stories rest in the place they have occupied for 2 centuries. Undisturbed, patient, waiting for a future that may be able to hear them more clearly than we can. The summer that was not a summer has ended. The mountain that ended it has long since settled into its new and smaller shape, its caldera filled with a cold lake, its slopes greened again by forest, its violence spent. The aerosols that circled the world and filtered the sunlight and killed the crops and drove the people are gone from the atmosphere, absorbed back into the chemistry of the planet from which they came. What remains is the world that was made by all of it, the world we live in, the world that carries in its bones and its soil and its demography and its literature and its invisible architectural archaeology, the long, reverberant consequence of a single terrible spring morning in April of 1815, on a distant island in the warm waters of the Flores Sea, when a mountain opened its throat and spoke in the only language volcanoes know, the language of total change, the language of the world before and the world after, the language of the sky turned wrong and the summer gone missing and the people, walking away from everything they had built, toward everything they hoped might be waiting for them somewhere else, in the cold and the strange light and the remarkable and terrible sunsets of the year that had no summer, the year that the world ended and continued anyway, as worlds do, as they always have, as perhaps they always will. Sleep now, the story has been told. Story has of, not all of it, perhaps not even most of it, because the full story of 1816 is not available to any single telling, but enough of it, enough to feel the weight of it, the strangeness of it, the connection of it to everything that came before and everything that came after. Enough to understand, as deeply as we can understand such things, that the world is older and stranger and more interconnected than ordinary experience suggests, that the cause of things is often very far from the things it causes, that the sky can be full of the material of a destroyed mountain and the people beneath it will not know why the summer has failed to come, and that the failure of the summer is enough to set in motion migrations and famines and pandemics and revolutions and great works of literature and the invention of the bicycle and the quiet disappearance of communities from the historical record, and perhaps, just perhaps, the end of a civilization that we have not yet fully found. The night is quiet. The world is turning. Somewhere in the dark, the long patient work of history is continuing, adding its new layers to the old ones, burying and revealing, erasing and inscribing, doing what it has always done, Since the first morning, there was a world to have a history. You are part of that history. Every human being who has ever breathed the air of this planet is part of that history, connected to every other human being who has ever breathed it by the single great fact of having lived here, in this place, under this sky, beneath the light of this particular star. The farmer in Vermont in 1816 is part of your history, whether you know his name or not. The people the alternative historians are looking for in the gaps of the record are part of your history, whether they existed as imagined or not. The children who arrived at the foundling hospitals without names are part of your history. They are all part of the long, unbroken thread of human presence on this earth, the thread that runs from the first fire, lit against the first dark, to this moment, this quiet, this particular point in the long story of everything that has happened and everything that will happen. Rest in that continuity. Rest in the knowledge that you are not alone in the dark, that the dark is full of the presence of everything that has come before, that the silence is not empty, but is instead full of the stories that have been told and the stories that have not yet been recovered, and the stories that may never be told, but that were lived nonetheless, in the cold light of a year that had no summer, under the strange and beautiful skies of 1816. The 1816 disaster. The year there was no summer. The year the world went quiet and then went on. It is over now. It has been over for a very long time, and yet in some way it is never over, because the world it made is still here, and we are still in it, and the questions it raises are still being asked, in the quiet hours of the night, in the space between waking and sleep, in the long, patient dark where all the best questions live. Good night. The story rests here, in the silence, in the dark, with all the other stories that have found their way to this same quiet place. They will be here when you wake. The world will be here, the sky will be here, ordinary and blue, or perhaps shot through with something extraordinary, as it sometimes is. As it was in 1816, when everything changed, when nothing was lost that was not already changing, when the silence that came after was not an ending, but a transformation, as all silences are, as the night always is, as sleep itself is, a passing through the dark toward whatever morning is waiting on the other side. There is a particular quality to the evidence that remains from 1816, a quality that is worth dwelling on before we let the story fully settle into the quiet of the night. It is the quality of abundance in some places and complete absence in others, a pattern of documentation that is itself part of the story, that tells us something about how the year was experienced and how it was survived and how it was remembered in the decades that followed. The New England diary tradition produced an extraordinary archive of first-hand accounts from the year without a summer. New England in 1816 was a relatively literate society by the standards of the time, with high rates of basic literacy and a strong Protestant tradition that encouraged the keeping of personal spiritual journals as a form of devotional practice. These journals, many of which were maintained with near-daily regularity by ministers and farmers and merchants and their wives and daughters, became, almost incidentally, meteorological and agricultural records of exceptional value. The people who kept them were not writing for posterity. They were not writing for historians. They were writing for God, or for themselves, or for the practical purpose of tracking the rhythms of a life organized around the seasonal cycle of agriculture. But what they recorded in their plain and unadorned language is irreplaceable. The Massachusetts Agricultural Repository and Journal, which was one of the earliest agricultural publications in the United States, published numerous accounts from farmers across New England describing the conditions of 1816 in detail that is extraordinary for its specificity. Dates of frosts, descriptions of crop conditions, accounts of the measures farmers took to try to salvage something from the failing growing season, reports on the state of the hay and the condition of the livestock, descriptions of the unusual weather patterns in language that is careful and observational in the best tradition of practical science. These accounts, read together, create a picture of the agricultural catastrophe of 1816 that is more vivid and more immediate than any subsequent historical reconstruction could achieve. What strikes a modern reader most forcibly about these accounts is not the drama of the catastrophe, though the catastrophe was real and terrible, but the quietness of the response to it. These were people who had been taught by their faith and their culture to expect hardship, to see suffering as a test of character and endurance, to respond to disaster with practical action rather than emotional demonstration. They do not write about the year without a summer, with anything like the intensity that we might expect. They write about it as they write about everything else, noting what they observe and recording what they do about it, and moving on to the next entry, the next observation, the next practical problem requiring a practical response. This quietness is its own kind of testimony. It tells us that the people who lived through 1816 understood what was happening to them, not as something exceptional and dramatic, but as something continuous with all the other hardships that life had presented to them. Something to be endured and adapted to, not something to be experienced with wonder or despair, but something to be dealt with, practically, one day at a time, one frozen crop at a time, one thin animal at a time, one empty root cellar at a time. The alternative history community, looking at this record, sometimes reads into it a different kind of testimony. If the people of 1816 responded to the catastrophe with such quietness, such apparent absence of extraordinary distress, could it be that they were responding not to something unprecedented, but to something that was, in some terrible way, familiar? Could it be that the climate catastrophe of 1816 was not the first such event in recent memory, that there had been other resets, other years without summer, other moments of civilizational disruption that had already habituated the survivors to a certain level of catastrophic change as simply part of the background condition of life? This is a speculative reading, and we offer it as speculation, not as established fact. But it is a reading that is worth holding in mind as we continue to move through the evidence, because the question of what the people of 1816 already knew, what they had already experienced, what their cultural memory carried in it from previous events that the official historical record does not fully document, is a question that the conventional history does not address with any thoroughness. The Monde Minimum, the period from roughly 1645 to 1715, during which solar activity was at an unusually low level and global temperatures were correspondingly depressed, is a documented period of climate stress that preceded 1816 by only a century. 100 years before the year without a summer, large portions of the Northern Hemisphere were already experiencing the kind of cold summers and failed harvests and associated social disruptions that 1816 would bring again. The mechanisms were different, solar minimum rather than volcanic aerosols, but the effects on agriculture and society were in some ways similar. A century is within living memory, transmitted through the stories of grandparents and great-grandparents. The people of 1816 may have had access, through oral tradition and family history, to memories of the Monde Minimum and its consequences, memories of the cold and the hunger and the migrations of 100 years before. Those memories might have shaped, in subtle ways, the cultural resources they brought to the catastrophe of their own time, might have given them a framework, however imperfect and incomplete, for understanding that the world could do this, that the summer could fail, that it was possible to survive it if you were lucky and resourceful and willing to do what had to be done. This is speculation, but it is not empty speculation. The transmission of cultural memory about catastrophic events is a real process that operates in real communities through oral tradition and religious narrative and folk custom and the stories that grandparents tell their grandchildren, by firelight in the winters of their lives. Communities that have survived previous catastrophes often carry, in their cultural DNA, a set of adaptive responses, a set of what to do when everything goes wrong strategies that are encoded in tradition without being explicitly labeled as emergency protocols. These strategies are activated in times of crisis without their users always being aware that they are drawing on a stored response to a previous crisis. The New England farmers who responded to the failure of 1816 with the combination of practical adaptation and community support that many of them demonstrated were doing so within a tradition that had been shaped by previous generations' encounters with hardship, including hardships that had climate dimensions, even if those dimensions were never explained in meteorological terms. The knowledge of how to stretch a failing harvest, how to identify the most cold-tolerant crops, how to slaughter and preserve animals in the right order to maximize the food supply through a long cold winter, how to organize community support for the most vulnerable households. All of this was stored in the culture, transmitted through practice and observation, available when it was needed precisely because previous generations had needed it and had figured it out and had passed it on. This is one of the ways that history is transmitted, that the official record often fails to capture. Not in documents and dates, but in practices and skills, and the knowledge embedded in how a community organizes itself in a crisis. When that knowledge is lost, when the community that carried it is disrupted, or dispersed, or erased, the loss is real and consequential, even if it leaves no trace in the official record. When the alternative historians look for the civilization that was lost in the early 19th century, they are looking, among other things, for the knowledge that civilization carried, the adaptive knowledge, the crisis knowledge, the what to do when everything fails knowledge, that was encoded in its culture and that disappeared with it. Whether or not a civilization was lost, in the way the Tartaria hypothesis proposes, the question of what was lost in the disruption of 1816 and its aftermath is a real and important question. Communities that were dissolved and populations that were displaced and orphaned, children who were raised by strangers, all represent losses of cultural continuity, losses of the transmitted knowledge that is the most fragile and the most important product of any functioning community. The specific knowledge of how to farm a particular piece of ground, how to read the particular weather patterns of a particular valley, how to manage the particular resources of a particular landscape, all of this was carried in the heads of the farmers who left, and it left with them, and the places they left behind were not only emptied of people, but emptied of the knowledge that made those people able to live in those places. This is true in small ways and large ways. The small ways are visible in the landscape of rural New England, in the stone walls running through the middle of second-growth forest, in the cellar holes overgrown with moss and ferns, in the abandoned orchards gone wild, in the graveyards on hillsides with names on them that do not appear in any living family's genealogy. These are the traces of the knowledge that left, the practice knowledge of how to make a farm out of the rocky hillside soil of New England, the knowledge that is gone now and cannot be recovered, because the people who had it are gone, and the farms they built have long since been absorbed back into the forest. The large ways are less visible and more speculative. If there was a civilization of the scale and sophistication that the Tartaria hypothesis proposes, the knowledge that civilization carried would have been correspondingly large and sophisticated. The knowledge of how to build the grand buildings that the alternative historians point to as evidence of an advanced pre-existing civilization, how to cut and transport and precisely fit the massive stone blocks that appear in the foundations of buildings around the world, how to lay out the neoclassical urban plans that seem to appear fully formed in cities that the official history says were built in the early 19th century by newly formed civic governments with limited resources. That knowledge would have been encoded in the culture of that civilization and would have been lost when the civilization was disrupted. The alternative historians who look at the grand neoclassical buildings of cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, Washington, London, and dozens of others, and ask how communities that were supposedly still recovering from the disruptions of the early 19th century managed to build them with such speed and such sophistication, are asking a question that has a conventional answer, but that the conventional answer does not always fully satisfy. The conventional answer is that these buildings were built by increasingly sophisticated construction industries, drawing on improving technical knowledge and the labor of workers who were paid with the capital accumulation of industrializing economies. This is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain the degree of architectural continuity, the way in which these buildings, built supposedly by new and different societies than the ones that had previously occupied the land, seem to draw on exactly the same architectural vocabulary as the ruins and the fragments of earlier buildings that the alternative historians say are evidence of an earlier civilization. The argument is subtle, and it is easy to miss in its subtlety. It is not merely that old buildings look like new buildings, which is unremarkable since architectural styles are always transmitted across time. It is that the level of technical sophistication required to build the old buildings and the level of technical sophistication evident in the new buildings are remarkably continuous with each other, in a way that is difficult to explain if we assume that the old buildings were the product of one civilization and the new buildings were the product of a completely different one that had to rediscover the technical knowledge from scratch. If a civilization was disrupted, if its population was reduced or displaced, if the institutions that transmitted its technical knowledge were broken up, we would normally expect to see a significant gap in the level of architectural sophistication of what was built immediately after the disruption, a period of rebuilding and relearning and experimentation before the higher levels of technical achievement were recovered. This is what we see, for example, in the archaeological record of Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a clear and documented fall in the scale and sophistication of construction over several centuries, before the gradual recovery that eventually produced the great cathedrals of the medieval period. The alternative historians argue that we do not see this kind of gap in the architectural record of the early 19th century. We see, instead, a period of apparent disruption followed almost immediately by the construction of buildings of extraordinary scale and sophistication. Buildings that required a level of technical knowledge and organizational capacity that the newly formed civic and national governments of the post-Napoleonic period should not, on the conventional account, have possessed. The explanation they offer is that the technical knowledge was not rediscovered from scratch, but was inherited. That the buildings of the early 19th century were built by people who had access to the technical traditions of the civilization that the reset had disrupted, and that this explains the continuity of technical achievement. This argument is one that professional historians do not take seriously, for reasons that are understandable, and some that are less so. The understandable reason is that the conventional account of how the grand buildings of the early 19th century were actually built is well documented and does not require the hypothesis of an inherited technical tradition from a disrupted civilization. The engineering innovations of the early industrial period, the development of new building materials and new construction techniques, the availability of increasing quantities of skilled labor, all of these are real and documented and provide a sufficient explanation for the buildings without invoking anything more exotic. The less understandable reason that professional historians dismiss the alternative history argument is a kind of institutional defensiveness, a resistance to the suggestion that the official history might be systematically misleading in a way that would require a comprehensive re-examination of the field's assumptions. This resistance is understandable as a human response to a challenge that threatens the foundations of a professional identity, but it is not good scholarship. Good scholarship requires the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it goes, even if it goes to uncomfortable places, even if it requires revising deeply held assumptions about what happened and when. The honest scholarly position on the Tartaria hypothesis is that it raises questions that the conventional history does not always answer satisfactorily, that some of the evidence it points to is genuinely anomalous in ways that deserve careful examination, and that the gap between what the evidence might support and what the most extreme versions of the theory claim is very large. The honest, scholarly position is neither to dismiss the whole enterprise as conspiracy thinking, nor to accept its most dramatic claims without much better evidence than currently exists. The year. Without a Summer sits within this debate as a kind of hinge point, a moment when the evidence from multiple directions, the climate data, the population records, the architectural anomalies, the orphan surges, the stories of mass migration and community dissolution, all converges on the same general period and creates a picture of the early 19th century that is more complicated and more uncertain than the official history suggests. In Russia, the story of 1816 has dimensions that are not always included in the Western-centric accounts of the year without a summer, but that are significant and that connect in interesting ways to the broader questions we have been exploring. The Russian Empire in the 1810s was engaged in the long and difficult process of absorbing the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars, which had brought the Grande Armée to the gates of Moscow and resulted in one of the most destructive military campaigns in European history. The Russian interior, particularly the regions that had been in the path of the French advance and retreat, had been devastated by the passage of armies and by the deliberate burning of Moscow that preceded the French occupation. The harvest failures of 1816 struck a Russia that was already in a weakened state, that had been impoverished by years of war and occupation, and that had significant portions of its agricultural heartland still struggling to recover from the physical destruction of the military campaigns. The official Russian records from this period document the harvest failures and the associated food shortages with the bureaucratic precision that characterize the Tsarist administrative system, but the records are incomplete and in some cases clearly understated, as was common in a system where admitting failure to the central authorities could have negative consequences for the officials doing the reporting. What the Russian records do show, and what is consistent with the alternative history perspective, is a pattern of rapid urbanization in the years following 1816, a movement of population from rural areas towards cities that was faster and more dramatic than the conventional account of Russian economic development in this period would predict. Cities that the official history describes as relatively small in the early 19th century showed population growth rates in the 1820s and 1830s that are difficult to account for purely on the basis of natural population. Increase from the populations that were supposedly there before. The alternative historians point to this as evidence of a larger migration than the official record acknowledges, a migration that drew on populations that are not fully documented in the records. The case of St. Petersburg is particularly interesting in this context. The city had been founded by Peter the Great at the beginning of the 18th century and had grown throughout that century to become one of the largest and most architecturally ambitious cities in Europe. The grand neoclassical buildings that line the Neva River and fill the center of St. Petersburg are among the most impressive examples of early 19th century architecture anywhere in the world. The official history tells us that these buildings were constructed in the decades before and after 1816, in a period of extraordinary architectural ambition when the Russian Empire was asserting its identity as a great European power through the medium of monumental urban construction. The alternative historians look at these buildings and ask questions that are not unreasonable. Some of them ask about the scale of the buildings, the precision of their construction, the sophistication of their engineering, and whether these qualities are consistent with what the conventional history tells us about the technical capacities of the construction industry in early 19th century Russia. Others ask about the ground level of the buildings, about the pattern of basement windows and partially buried lower floors that appears in some of the older structures in the city, and whether this pattern is consistent with the gradual accumulation of street-level material over time, or whether it suggests something more sudden. We offer these questions in the same spirit in which we have offered all the questions in this story, not as definitive evidence for any particular conclusion, but as part of the honest acknowledgement that the story of 1816 and its world is more complex and more uncertain than the textbooks suggest, and that complexity and uncertainty are not problems to be resolved by confident assertion, but are conditions to be inhabited with patience and curiosity. The patience of the night is the right frame for this kind of complexity. In the daytime, with all the urgency and the practical demands of the waking world, it is difficult to sit with what is not known, to hold the uncertainty without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. The night allows a different relationship to uncertainty. In the dark, the things that are not yet known do not press for resolution. They simply exist, as the darkness exists, as the silence exists, as the long history of the world exists in all its incompleteness and all its complexity. Let us return, in this spirit, to the physical world of 1816 and to some of its details that have not yet been explored with the fullness they deserve. The volcanism of the early 19th century was not limited to Tambora. The years on either side of 1816 were among the most volcanically active in the geological record of the past 5 centuries. The cluster of eruptions that preceded and followed Tambora suggests something about the state of the planet's volcanic system during this period that goes beyond the random chance of individual eruptions. Some geologists and climate scientists have proposed that periods of volcanic clustering in which multiple large eruptions occur within a relatively short time span may be related to broader planetary processes, to changes in tectonic stress patterns, to the influence of glacial loading and unloading on magma chamber pressures, or to other mechanisms that are not yet fully understood. The Laki eruption in Iceland in 1783 and 1784, which occurred only 30 years before Tambora and which produced a volcanic winter of its own, killing a fifth of Iceland's population through famine and disease and causing measurable temperature anomalies across Europe, may have been part of the same broad period of elevated volcanic activity. The Soufriere eruption in 1812, the Awu eruption in 1812, the Mayon eruption in 1814. All of these events in the years leading up to Tambora suggest a period when the volcanic systems of the world were unusually active, when the deep processes of the Earth were discharging unusual quantities of material and energy through its surface. Whether this volcanic clustering was itself the product of some broader planetary disturbance, some shift in the deep mechanics of the Earth that was large enough to affect multiple volcanic systems simultaneously, is a question that conventional geology does not currently have a definitive answer to. The alternative history community tends to see in this volcanic clustering evidence for a large-scale planetary event, a pole shift or a celestial encounter or some other process that was responsible for the reset that they hypothesize, and that expressed itself in the geological record as a period of unusual volcanic and seismic activity. The conventional geological explanation for volcanic clustering is more prosaic, involving the feedback mechanisms between glacial retreat and crustal pressure that are well documented in the geological record. As the glaciers of the Little Ice Age began retreating in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they released pressure on the crustal rock beneath them, which in turn affected the pressure conditions in underlying magma chambers and potentially increased the likelihood of volcanic eruptions. This is a real mechanism that real geological research supports, and it provides a rational explanation for the clustering of volcanic events without invoking anything more exotic. But the rational explanation and the alternative explanation are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is possible to accept that glacial retreat was one of the mechanisms contributing to volcanic clustering in the early 19th century, while also acknowledging that the full picture of what was happening to the planet during that period is not yet completely understood, and that the convergence of multiple unusual events, volcanic, climatic, social, demographic, within a relatively short time span, is itself something that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The historian William Stanhope, writing in the 1850s about the events of the 1810s, described the decade as one of the most eventful and catastrophic in living memory, a decade in which the human world had been subjected to a series of shocks that would have seemed incredible if described in advance, and that were difficult to comprehend even in retrospect. He was writing primarily about the political events of the decade, about Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, and the redrawing of the European map. But his description applies with equal or greater force to the natural and demographic events of the same period. The 1810s were indeed one of the most eventful and catastrophic decades in human history, in ways that the political narrative alone does not capture. What the alternative historians are trying to capture, with their Tartaria hypothesis and their mudflood theory and their analysis of architectural anomalies and population gaps, is some portion of the totality of what happened in that decade, some recognition that the catastrophe was larger and more comprehensive than the official history, with its focus on the dramatic and well-documented political events, has been able to fully convey. Whether they are right about the specific mechanisms they propose, whether there was indeed a lost civilization of the scale and sophistication they describe, whether the mudflood was a real event or a metaphor for a complex of real events, these questions remain genuinely open. But the impulse behind the inquiry is not wrong. The decade of the 1810s was a decade of civilizational crisis on a scale that is difficult to fully grasp from within the framework of the official history, which tends to emphasize the successful resolution of the Napoleonic era and the relative stability of the post-Vienna order that followed it. The successful resolution and the relative stability are real, but so is the suffering, the dislocation, the loss, the silence of those who did not make it into the records, the buried lower stories of buildings that were once at street level, the orphans without surnames, the farms without families, the communities without continuity. We hold all of this, as the night holds everything, without insisting on resolution, without demanding that the uncertainty give way to certainty before it is ready to. The year 1816 is a year that asks us to hold uncertainty, to sit with what is not known, to respect the silence of those who left no record by acknowledging that the silence is not emptiness. The agricultural geographies that the year without a summer reshaped are not fully appreciated in most historical accounts. When large numbers of farmers leave a particular region and new farmers settle new regions, the patterns of land use that are established in the generation following the disruption often persist for centuries. The crops that were planted by the New England migrants who settled in Ohio and Indiana in the late 1810s and 1820s were not identical to the crops they had grown in Vermont and New Hampshire. The land was different, the climate was different, the soil was different, and the agricultural knowledge that had been adapted to the specific conditions of the New England hills had to be modified for the conditions of the Midwest prairie. This modification was a process of learning and experimentation and failure and success, and the agricultural practices that emerged from it shaped American farming for generations. Similarly, the agricultural landscapes that the New England migrants left behind did not simply revert to their pre-settlement condition. The land that had been cleared for farming, the soils that had been cultivated for generations, the drainage patterns that had been altered by the creation of farm ponds and the removal of beaver, all of these continued to change in the absence of the farmers who had created them. The forest that reclaimed the abandoned farms of New England was not the same forest that had been cleared in the first place. It was a secondary forest, growing on soils that had been altered by agriculture, containing species mixes that were different from the original old-growth forest, and it was growing in a landscape that bore the marks of human occupation in every stone wall and cellar hole and apple tree gone wild. This transformation of the New England landscape from agricultural to forested is one of the great ecological stories of the 19th century, and it has its roots in the year without a summer and the migrations that the climate catastrophe triggered. The people who left took with them the agricultural purpose that had held the landscape in its cleared and cultivated form. When they left, the landscape began to change, back towards something more like its pre-agricultural state, though never identical to it, because the marks of human occupation are not easily erased even by a forest given 2 centuries to grow. The forest that covers much of rural New England today, the forest that hikers walk through and tourists admire and naturalists study, is in large part the product of 1816. It is the forest that grew up on the farms that were abandoned because the summer failed and the crops died and the people walked west toward Ohio. It is, in its way, a monument to the year without a summer, a living record of the disruption that the Tambora aerosols caused, written in trees and mosses and stone walls half consumed by roots. The trees do not know this. The forest has no memory of the farms it replaced, or the people who made those farms, or the cold summer that drove those people away. It is simply a forest, doing what forests do, growing and dying and growing again, indifferent to the history that created the conditions for its existence. But we know it, and knowing it changes the way the forest looks, gives it a quality of historical depth that the purely ecological view does not convey, makes it a place where the past is not absent, but present in a form that requires a particular kind of attention to see. This is what the year without a summer ultimately teaches, if we are willing to receive the lesson, slowly and with patience, in the long night of contemplation that the story deserves. It teaches that the past is not behind us. It teaches that the world we live in is the world that the past made, in ways that are sometimes obvious and often invisible, in ways that are sometimes documented and often silent. It teaches that the boundary between the present and the past is not a wall, but a membrane, permeable in both directions, allowing the consequences of past events to flow forward into the present and allowing the questions of the present to flow backward into the past. The people who lived through 1816 are gone. The farms they left behind are forest. The communities they built in the new places they went are in many cases also gone, or changed beyond recognition. The records they kept, the ones that survived, tell us something about what they experienced, but not everything. The records they did not keep, the experiences they did not write down, the communities that dissolved before anyone could document them, these are the silence at the center of the year without a summer, the darkness inside the story that the story cannot fully illuminate. But the darkness is not empty. It contains everything that happened, all of it, the full weight of 2 centuries of human beings, trying to survive a year that had no summer and finding out what they were made of in the process. That weight is real, even if it cannot be measured. That presence is real, even if it cannot be seen. The silence at the center of 1816 is as full of human experience as any part of the story that is documented and told. As the night deepens around you, let this fullness be present. Let the year 1816 rest in your awareness, not as a set of facts and dates and consequences, though it is all of those things, but as a human experience, as the experience of millions of people who woke up one morning in the spring of 1816 and went out to look at their crops, and noticed that the light was strange and the air was cold and something was wrong, and who spent the following months and years finding out just how wrong it was and doing what human beings always do in the face of catastrophe, which is to try, with whatever resources they have, to continue. They continued. Most of them continued. The ones who did not continue, who became the silence, who became the gaps in the record, and the orphans at the foundling hospitals, and the farms without families, and the communities without continuity. They are also part of what happened. They are the part that cost the most. They are the part that the official history is most inclined to pass over quickly, because the official history prefers stories of resolution and recovery, stories in which the crisis is followed by the rebuilding, in which the disruption gives way to the new order, in which the loss is acknowledged but not dwelt upon. We have dwelt upon it. We have tried, in the long telling of this story, to give the loss its proper weight, to acknowledge the silence as a form of presence, to treat the people who left no record with the same attention and the same respect that we give to the people who did. We have tried to hold the conventional history and the alternative history together, not collapsing one into the other, not pretending that the official account is complete and satisfactory, not pretending that the alternative account is established and proven, but holding both of them as genuine attempts to understand a year that remains, in some essential way, beyond full understanding. The year 1816 was a hinge in history, not the only hinge, not even the most dramatic hinge, but a genuine one, a moment when the forces that shape human civilization, the geological, the climatic, the demographic, the political, the cultural, all moved at once and in the same direction, creating conditions that remade the world in ways both large and small, both documented and silent, both recovered and lost. The world they made is the world we live in. The forest that grew on their abandoned farms is the forest that still stands. The descendants of the orphans they left in the foundling hospitals are among us, carrying their missing genealogies into the present. The communities that formed when the New England migrants reached Ohio and the German migrants reached Pennsylvania have shaped the culture and the politics and the economy of the United States in ways that trace back through a long chain of consequence to the decision made by a family in Vermont in the autumn of 1816 to load a wagon and walk west. All of this is still present, in the way that the past is always present, in the forms and patterns and consequences it left behind. The year 1816 has not ended. It has transformed. It has become the world. And so we come, at last, to the end of the telling, though not to the end of the story, which has no end, which continues in the forms it left behind, and in the questions it continues to raise, and in the silence at its center that still waits to be heard. The night is very deep now. The world outside is still. Whatever sounds you hear, the wind or the rain or the settling of the house into its own history, are the sounds of a world that is older and stranger and more layered than any single moment of experience can hold. They are the sounds of a world that has been through the year without a summer, and everything that came before it, and everything that came after it, and is still here, still turning, still holding its complicated history in the way that the earth holds everything, in stone and soil and the memory of roots. Let the story rest. It has been told as fully as a single telling can tell it. The parts that are known have been given their due. The parts that are unknown have been acknowledged in their silence. The conventional history and the alternative history have been held together, not resolved, but held in the way that all genuine complexity must be held, without forcing it into a simplicity it does not possess. The year 1816 was the year that had no summer, the year the sky turned strange colors, and the crops died, and the people moved, and the world changed. The year a mountain spoke in the only language it knew, and the people living beneath its sky tried to understand what they were hearing and could not, but survived it anyway, most of them, and went on, and built new things in new places, and left behind the silence of the ones who did not go on. And the forest grew over everything, and the history moved forward into the world we are still making. Sleep. The night will hold what remains. The story will be here when you need it. The questions will be here too, patient in the dark, waiting for the light, which is not yet, which is not yet, which is not yet. Rest now. The summer will return. It always has. Even after the years when it seemed it would not come, even after the volcanic winters and the little ice ages and the climate disruptions that shook human civilization to its foundations, the summer has always come again. Eventually, imperfect and uncertain, but present. The light returning to the fields, the warmth returning to the soil, the seeds that survived the cold finding their way upward toward a sky that is once again doing what summer skies are supposed to do. The summer returns. It is on its way. It is always on its way, even in the deepest cold, even in the longest dark, even in the year when it seems to have forgotten itself and gone somewhere else without telling anyone. The warmth is coming. The light is building, somewhere beyond the horizon, patient and reliable as anything in the natural world, as certain as the turning of the planet on its ancient axis. But for now, in this moment, in this quiet, in the long breathing of the sleeping world, it is enough to rest in the dark and let the story of 1816 settle into whatever place it finds in the landscape of your dreaming. Let the farmer in Vermont sleep too. Finally, after all these years, let the crops that froze in June sleep in the cold ground. Let the people on the roads walking west put down their burdens and rest. Let the children in the foundling hospitals sleep, the ones without surnames, the ones who arrived with no one to claim them, the ones who grew up without knowing where they came from. Let them all sleep now, in the quiet of the long night, in the warmth of whatever summer they eventually found. The mountain on the island of Sumbawa is sleeping. Its caldera lake reflects the sky without comment. The water is cold and still and deep, and far below it, in the rock, in the dark, the earth is breathing some in the way it always breathes, slow and deep and ancient, on timescales that make the whole of human history into a single heartbeat, a single, drawn breath, a single moment of awareness in the long, unconscious being of the planet. We are that moment. We are the awareness that the earth is not aware of, the history that the rock does not remember, the warmth that persists even after the summer fails, because warmth is not only a matter of temperature, it is a matter of connection, of the bonds between human beings, of the communities they make and the care they offer each other in the cold years and the dark years and the years that have no summer. That warmth does not go away when the summer fails. It was there in Vermont in 1816, in the neighbor who shared his hay with the neighbor whose hay had run out, in the community that organized to bring food to the families who had none, in the church that opened its doors to the homeless, in the practical care that people extended to each other in the face of a catastrophe they could not understand but could face together. That warmth is here now, in this quiet, in this night, in the telling of a story that matters, because the people in it mattered, because their lives and their losses and their survival and their silence all mattered, because everything that was human in 1816 was as fully human as anything that is human now, as deserving of attention and care and the simple acknowledgement that it happened, that they were there, that the year without a summer was lived by real people who did not choose it and could not control it and survived it, most of them, and passed on to us, through all the generations between, the world we inhabit and the questions we are still asking about it. The year without a summer, the year that had no summer that year. It is over, and it is not over. Sleep well.